Unterofficer Eric Lang wakes, long after the dawn, to the distant sound of artillery. The gunmetal sky rips with the threatening black clouds, and the dusty smell of rain hangs in the chill air. He is slumped back against the earthen wall, his left arm crooked and folded behind him. He comes awake in a flare of pinpricks and fire, and he winces as he works it free and shakes. His slender frame is wrapped in his thick woolen coat, soddened and heavy with mud, and he feels cold water seeping through the threadbare trousers. Besides the upturned helmet lying in the mud a few yards away, he is alone in this narrow trench. He pulls his long legs towards his body and stands, feeling the cold air glide through the shifting folds in his clothes. The coat tugs at him as he stands, weighed down with filth. There is water in his boots, running down his legs as he stands to soak through the layered socks that protect the last bit of warmth and dryness. He scowls at the mud in the sky. They are unmoved. He winces against the sudden pain in his head and chest as he tries to sort out the jumble of memories and awakening thoughts. He wonders idly what day it is, but he cannot recall the chaplain's last sermon, the only landmark he has to make the progress of the days. He tries to remember the night before, or at least some small hint of how he ended up here, soaked up rainwater in a trench. The preceding days are a monotone fog, a jumble of images and impressions of mud-soaked boredom and terror. "Thought you might be dead," comes a voice from his left. He turns to see a figure, leaning on a wooden post at the crook of the trench. His face is obscured by a gloved hand gripping a smoldering cigarette. Eric blinks and strains to focus on the man, but his blood is now surging in anticipation of tobacco. He takes a few awkward steps, and he can see now the crooked chin and bulbous nose of Karl Strauss. Aromatic smoke seeps from beneath his yellowed teeth, and Eric, wordlessly, extends his hand. Karl drops the small leather pouch into them. When Eric has rolled, lit, and inhaled his first cigarette, he clears his throat and spits on the hard-packed earth. "Why did you let me sleep out here? I could have froze," he rasps. His voice is raw, and catches when he speaks. Karl chuckles, a deep rumble from his barreled chest, and flicks his cigarette against the wall. It collides noiselessly with the support beam and blossoms into 100 monetary sparks. "I let you do what you like, then." He grins at Eric and clasps him sharply on the back. Eric momentarily considers anger, but cannot find the heart for it. The low tremor of a distant explosion ripples through the dirt, and Eric stiffens. "Big guns, far away," Karl says, and Eric begins to relax. "Us or them?" Karl shrugs and his eyes bulge slightly. For the 1,000th time, Eric can see how perfectly Karl was suited to this life before the war. He pictures Karl on the stage, grease paint glinting in the lights, playing the clown, the fool for the cream of Bavaria, a natural. Out here in the blind spot of God, Karl is a natural of another sort. Eric has been with him in the beginning, since Belgium. Eric can recall the clown's visage, how pleasant and comical still, in the firefight of Andean, as they burned the village and fearing guerrilla fighters shot all the men. Karl and Eric walked the trench, taking the traverse back through the lines. A few men huddled for warmth in small groups, smoking or warming their hands on tin mugs of coffee. There is a lethargic stillness to the men, and they keep their eyes fixed on the ground or skyward, but avoid eye contact. Eric is grateful for the quiet passage, at least. The first guard post is empty, and mounted machine gun and mortar are unattended. Eric looks to Karl, but he seems unconcerned. Karl has kept a small rank superiority to Eric for the past 3 years, and Eric has come to depend on relinquishing all judgment and worry to the older man. He has allowed to live this long, unquestioningly. Only the chaplain sits at the mess hall benches, solemnly dipping a crumbling dry biscuit into his coffee. Karl and Eric join him, following his lead to soften the rocky bread. The chaplain, Sebastian Rouse, looks up at them with watery brown eyes through his scratched and clipped spectacles, and nods, almost impredictably, before returning to the patient vivisection of his meal. Eric thinks to ask him what day it is, but can't imagine knowing would be worth the effort, and moves to lay his jacket on a small stove. Enigmatic smoke drifts from it, and it seems no warmer than the surroundings. They sit silent, draining the last of the coffee and rolling cigarettes from Karl's seemingly endless pouch. "I just realized," started Sebastian, his voice tremulous from disuse. "I haven't seen an officer in at least all day." "This is a good thing, most likely," Karl huffs with his crooked grin. What if the line is breached, and we're cut off, with no one to tell us?" The chaplain does not appear worried, merely curious, for a moment. Eric considers the logic in this conclusion, and a cold panic begins to console him. "Stick to the servants, Vater," Karl snorts in disillusion. But the idea gnaws at Eric through the day. He passes scattered and listless men, all strangers to him, but no officers. It occurs that he cannot recall the last briefing they had. At an empty guidepost, he raises his head tentatively above the outside wall and gazes across the front towards the French line. As it has 1,000 times before, the stark unearthliness of a no-man's land catches his breath and turns his heart to ice. Jagged cinders in the shape of trees jut defiantly from the craters and hillocks of carrion-soaked mud. Eric can see blue hands clutching at the sky, and ragged shreds of boys from across the empire. The land is dead. Eric knows this in some deep and primal way. He's seen burned barns and razed towns, but out here, it's different somehow. There's a palpable emptiness, a hollow that absorbs all sounds and cuts away at those that persist in living here. Eric can feel it, reaching out from him from the monochrome charnel fields. A shiver twists around his spine. "I know it doesn't look like it. He is here." Sebastian's voice is quiet and hollow. Eric turns to regard the chaplain briefly before returning his gaze back to the void. "I admire your face, Sebastian." Eric leaves the next part unsaid. Sebastian has been incensed and dedicated, but they've had this conversation many times, and Eric knows that they are going through the motions to satisfy Sebastian's guilt. But today, he's too tired to humor him. Eric hasn't believed since Edian. Sebastian's smile is weary, and he looks grateful for Eric's non-participation. "You'll see," he says at last. They stand in silence as a thin and fevid miasma of fog drifts over the dead land and spills like molasses into the trench. Eric is looking at the fog thicken and blot out the unburied dead, when he turns to see Sebastian is gone. The fog in the dead land, stealing everything, even the sound of his footsteps. The sky darkens, and Eric gives up any hope of being dry or warm today. He picks out a lively tune in the distance, but the fog muffles the sound and robs the life from the notes. Eric tries to follow the weltering music, taking traverses and glancing down each line, but it always stays in the distance, circling around him in an encroaching gloom. At last it dies away, mid-stanza with a mournful trill, and Eric is alone in the deepening gloom. He fights down panic as he backtracks towards the front line. The dark and the mist have muffled the world. The only sound is the scratching shuffle of his wet wool coat and the tread of his boots. The trench is empty, and he is alone. Above him the sky is a bruised purple and darkening. He struggles to recall which direction the midship barracks are in, but this only makes him realize that he's not quite sure where he is at the moment. The fear has him now, a cold blue corpse hand clutching at his lung. He struggles to catch his breath, and the filthy damp in his clothes presses inward, smothering his skin and exhausting the heat like a flame. The world pinches a little, shudders, and then suddenly, aware of setting, Karl above him, and sliding a lit cigarette between his fingers. Eric catches a hold of his drumbeat heart and focuses on the warmth of the smoke. Karl is playing the father, his best parental mask on his face. "I worry about you, Eric," Karl says at last. "What is going on?" Eric demands. Karl smiles sadly and helps Eric to his feet. "Does it matter?" Karl offers at last, turning away. "Get some sleep, boy." He hums tunelessly, and soon the fog swallows his music and the burning ember of his cigarette, and Eric is alone again. For the first time he can remember, Karl's assurance has not thawed the frost in him. His heart begins to surge again, terror winding around his ventricles and constraining. He loses his breath and begins to pant, dropping his helmet and running his fingers through his filthy hair. The sky seems to contract around him, and the trench stretches away indefinitely. Eric is gripped by fear, and he slumps against the earthen barricade. There is a low thud, followed by an angry hiss, and a bright column of red fire arcs into the sky, igniting the black fog. The world is suddenly bright and painted crimson. He struggles to the edge of the trench and looks over the edge, hoping pitifully not to see what he knows is there. The nightmare landscape of filth and gore is cast into shape and dancing relief by the burning flare, and the graveyard is pitched out in sharp contrast. The dead trees loom menacingly, like prison bars around the dead. The fog hovers like a noxious living thing, its tendrils caressing the defiled earth. In the hellish stillness, he sees them, surging from the fog, hundreds, thousands of enemy, breaking across the pitted ground like a wave. Bayonets on rifles shudder across the surface like quills, and they are pressed together so close that Eric cannot pick one from the next. He grasps at his back for his rifle, and realizes with a sickening lurch that he doesn't have it. Hasn't had it all day. His sidearm holster is empty, the leather damp and torn. They are closer now. The world is silent. Eric can see their hollow, empty eye sockets. He can see their hanging, shattered jaws and torn, leathery skin. He can see the French soldiers in ragged uniforms and the torn, burnt shapes of civilians. He can see his friends, his comrades. They all bear down on him beneath the warning flare light and utter and broken quiet. They crash over the edge of the trench, and Eric feels a bayonet slide into his lungs, hears the rifles fire, and smells the burning wool and meat from his ragged wounds. He is crushed backward, his arm folding beneath him as he tumbles to the floor. The rotting thing above him stands, panting. Eric looks up to it, but instead of worm-choked cavities, he sees watery blue eyes and a filthy young face. He sees fears that matches his own. He sees a child. He begins to understand. The fog at last obscures his sight. Eric wakes long after the dawn to the distant sound of artillery. The gunmetal sky ripples with thickening black clouds. He is slumped back against the earthen wall, his arm crooked and folded behind him. It comes awake in the flare of pinpricks and fire, besides the upturned helmet lying in the mud a few yards away. He is alone.